Great, so let's get started. Hello, welcome to our webinar all about the 2025 Science GCSE results and what we can learn from them as educators. My name's Alison. I'm the Teacher Engagement Lead at Educake. I'm joined today by Tracey Baxter, who is a Trust Science Lead, and she's going to be sharing her insights on how to interpret and respond to the most recent GCSE results. We'll look at the success stories, the challenges, and how these compare to the previous year. We're also joined by Nicola Allen, who's the Managing Director of Educake. She's going to give a brief overview of the data analysis tools within Educake that can help you to learn more about your own students. Hopefully, you'll leave this session with lots of practical tips for effective assessment and feedback in science. Before we get started, I just want to draw your attention to the Q&A feature of this webinar. It should be at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for either Tracey or Nick, please do type them into the box. We'll answer them at the end of the presentation, which will be in about half an hour's time. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for coming. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tracey and Nick.
Thanks, Alison. I'll start us off. Good afternoon, everyone. We are 6 weeks into a very long 8-week half term, so really appreciate your time on a Monday evening. As Alison said, I'm a trust lead, a science lead for a couple of trusts, also an independent consultant. I also do some work for AQA and EdXL, so what I'm going to bring you today in terms of what we can learn from the 2025 results, just so that you know where it's come from. It's incorporating EdXL, AQA, across specialisms and across the different foundation and higher tier. If anybody's OCR, I'll be honest, I haven't done in any great depth looking at OCR, but it's such a small population of schools that are using OCR that I wouldn't imagine it'd be any different. So when I look at AQA and EdXL, it's so similar when you see the messages that come out of GCSE. So I'm assuming it will be just the same for OCR. So yeah, we're going to look very briefly at the tricky topics from the 2025 GCSEs, then go to the wider skill areas or question types, and then move on to what can we possibly do about it? How can we make the most basically of the data that we've got? We're overrun with data in schools, aren't we? And especially in science, because it's very complicated. And we need to be able to make the most out of all that data that we're bothering to gather to support our students moving forward. So just some general patterns. Combined science entries increased slightly, despite the 16-year-old population has decreased very slightly. I think that's probably influenced by that next bullet point and that second bullet point that we had separate science entries decreasing. The biggest was in biology. There's always a bigger population of biology, single biology, so that's had the biggest decrease. I think lots of us have seen that. Lots of schools I've worked with, I've seen more than ever that students have been moved across from separate sciences to combined science when you feel that, they could probably get 2 better grades and 3 not so good grades. And that's partly to do with the volume of content and things that we've got, and still sort of living out those COVID years, I think. And if anybody does synergy with AQA, that's had quite a big decrease this year as well at 7.5%. So I think people are just trying to streamline and just stick with fewer pathways, makes things a bit more simple. In terms of the outcomes, combined science outcomes improved very slightly, fairly static from 2024 to 25, but a slight increase in combined science at all grades. And we've got that usual pattern of girls outperforming boys again in combined science nationally. I know quite a few schools I work with, they've booked that trend and the boys have outperformed the girls in combined science. So it's just worth looking at that for your own cohort and keeping an eye on why that might be. I know some schools, if you're very sort of boy heavy, the girls can sometimes get a bit lost, and it's just worth monitoring that as they go through with the mocks and your other assessments that you do. For biology, chemistry and physics, we've seen improvements at grade 7. As we've had in previous years, chemistry was the highest performing, then it was physics, and biology was the weaker one of the 3. Again, we've got boys outperforming girls in physics. That's the same pattern we've had before. Girls outperforming boys in biology, and more similarities at chemistry, which is what we tend to get. So nothing different there. So you've got girls outperforming at 7+ and boys outperforming at 4+. And that's generally what we've seen previously. Okay, but go on to tricky topics. This is quite big. I'm assuming, Alison, everybody will get the slides after this, so you don't need to, be able to read all of this right now. I'm only going to go over this quite quickly. I always flag at this time of year what the tricky topics have been, but for me, it's just so important that this just gives you other questions to ask. So it's okay saying, for example, students are not very good at osmosis, or students are not very good at the series and parallel circuits. But it's why that happened, isn't it? That's really important. So we can't just assume the rubbish at immune system and the rubbish at monoclonal antibodies if they're doing biology only. We've got to think about why. And when we talk about sort of the cycle improvement later on, I'll bring that out. So although I've flagged that up, I can say, okay, management of diabetes is pretty poor there, but we had a 6-mark question, for example, and it could be that it's that 6-mark question style that is more of the problem than the knowledge. It could be that it was a particular context and it was unfamiliar that threw them. So good to look at the tricky topics, and good for you to definitely focus in on that, but use it then to ask another question about, do I need to change something around my teaching and learning, or is it something around that skill or that question style that's quite difficult? Some of these things we see coming up all the time. Obviously, we don't test the whole syllabus, the whole spec, but when we see immune system coming up on a question, for example, that tends to cause problems. Gas tests come up every year that they're tested, they come up as a problem. Anything to do with calculations usually comes up as a problem. We've got those similar things. Electricity generally causes a problem for physics as well. Nick, before I move on from this, have you done analysis from the educate point of view of what you found as a challenge?
Yes, actually, we have. So we actually record our national data on every single question that's answered on Educate. So we have hundreds of millions of questions answered a year. And actually, I made a brief note thinking that you were going to cover this. So I can concur actually that for biology, DNA and the immune system came up or comes up as a particular tricky topic that we've identified on Educate. Chemistry, we've got electrolysis, but to be honest, general chemistry practical work, we're seeing that being a challenging area for students across the board. Activation energy, of course, for chemistry as well. And then I think you mentioned series and parallel circuits for physics. And we also can confirm stopping distances and distance times. They definitely agree with the tricky topics that you've mentioned here. But of course, we record everything that
Yeah.
teachers assess, not just what goes into the GCSEs.
Yeah, so yours will be a bigger wealth, won't it? Because ours is a snapshot, depending on what was assessed, obviously, in the GCSEs this year. Fab, thank you. So going on to the wider skill areas then, because I think we can get even more information from these, because when you put the two together, the tricky topics and these wider skill areas, it gives us even more sort of questions to ask and focuses to hone in on, really, for us to check about our cohort, whether it's an issue for them. So we've got these skill areas that have caused problems for our students. We've also got in each of these areas, we've seen some wins, some positives from previously. So for each of these, command words, practicals, maths, application to unfamiliar context, so that aspect of AO2, exam technique, and extended open response, we've got some things that have improved, but we've got some things that are definitely a challenge. So I'm just going to go over those for you one by one, so that you can start to reflect on your own cohort and think, okay, if that's what's happening nationally, am I seeing that picture with my own cohort? So command words. If you've looked at sort of messages from GCSEs before, you will know that it tends to be describe and explain. And again, the biggest challenge this year has been describe and explain. But if we start with a positive, we have seen at foundation tier better structure of an explain answer. That doesn't mean they've answered it particularly well, because the knowledge and understanding might not be there, but you can see that whatever you've been doing to train your students, for example, to put because in that answer, more foundation students were doing that. So even if they didn't have the knowledge and understanding, they're starting to see what that command word really needs in a good response to it. In terms of challenges, describe and explain, as we've had before, and also state and give. So students struggling to know what the difference is between them. So we see things like they're asked a state question, it's one line, it only needs a few words, and they're going off the line and they're writing about 3 more lines, which is okay if they don't contradict themselves, but actually they're wasting time doing that. And there is a possibility that they say the right thing and then they contradict it and they negate those marks that they would have got. So we definitely see that. We're still seeing that age-old problem of where students are asked to describe and explain. They just stop at describe, or they describe again a bit louder, but actually they're saying the same thing. We see sometimes, particularly with higher tier students, where they're asked to explain, but the expectation is that that first mark is a say what you see, it's a describe. They're jumping straight in to the more difficult explain bit, and they're missing that easy mark in terms of describe. So those same old command words, what we think are quite low level, but actually if you look through a paper, I was just scanning through some papers before and going, look, describe, explain, state, give, explain, state, give, you know, those command words come up so often across the whole series. And we've also got compare that is an issue. We've seen this year questions that have asked students to compare or compare and contrast, or sometimes it's asking them to describe differences between things or explain differences between two things. And they need that comparative language, and that's what we've seen is missing. So they're not using those ER words of quicker, faster, slower, whatever it is, that just not using that comparative language. Practical skills. Generally, we've seen that students have been more familiar with the required or the core practicals, which is really positive because last year for chemistry particularly, we saw a real challenge with that across the exam boards. We see some stronger responses where students are starting to use label diagrams. I've seen students trying to answer questions around an electrical circuit without drawing an electrical circuit before, and that's really, really difficult, but more students were using diagrams. And this identifying control variables had come up last year and the year before as a challenge, but at higher tier at least, we are seeing some improvement in students being able to identify the control variables. However, in chemistry specifically, we've still got quite a few instances of students not knowing the names of that common apparatus, and therefore, when they're coming on to talk about a required or a core practical and the method and the purpose of those method steps for that apparatus, that's really challenging. We've said at higher tier, we've seen some improvements in identifying control variables, but at foundation tier, those control variables are still a challenge, with students quite often identifying a dependent or an independent variable when they're asked about a control variable. And then we've seen at higher tier where students can name a control variable, where questions have gone further and asked them why that would need to be controlled. That's where it's fallen down a little bit for them. We've seen at foundation tier, even though students are more familiar with the required or the core practicals, it's clear that they've come across those practicals before, they've seen them, but when they're asked to just describe a simple plan or the method that they would do to carry that out, there's some quite key details that are being missed out. And we saw that. I know extraction of DNA from fruit is not a core or required practical, but it is a spec point and it's a suggested practical in Edexcel, and it is something that they need to know. There were some really key details missing from that one. Students struggling to suggest valid improvements, which if you think they haven't got the basics necessarily of knowing about the variables and the apparatus, then they're going to really struggle to suggest valid improvements. And this one really doesn't surprise me. Lack of understanding of terms such as accuracy, precision, reliability. I think sometimes as teachers, I have to think really hard about those kind of things. I have to pre-plan those questions because it's so easy to start mixing those terms up in your head if you're coming up with those questions off the top of your head. So to have those questions there ready to use set out for you, I think is really important as a teacher. Math skills, generally math skills were not the biggest issue, and we saw this last year. You know, students having a formula sheet has really helped them. I think it helps with their confidence as well. And we've seen some math skills demonstrated fairly well. So calculating mean, substituting into a formula that they've been given, and then we've seen some other things like calculating the area of a circle. We saw using tally charts as well this year. They've generally performed better on extraction and interpretation of data from graphs and tables. So whatever you've been doing around that graphs and plotting points and using that data is having some effect. So well done for that. We have still seen some issues with physics in terms of, for example, extrapolating from graphs, and generally some more challenges with physics and the graphs. But they get a lot more of them, don't they? So they're asked a lot more about those. They come up a lot more in physics questions. So I guess it would be more of a challenge there. We've got some real clear challenges. There were some really clear messages that came out from the math stuff. Unit conversion is a real challenge across specialisms and across both foundation and higher tier. If a question, a calculation needed students to do a unit conversion, that is the most commonly missed mark. So that unit conversion, is it that they don't know how to do it? is that they're just missing the instruction to do that. They've missed it from looking at the question. They're not looking, for example, at the answer line for the clue of what the units are on there, because that should guide them of whether they need to do a unit conversion. We've had the other thing, when you don't need to do a unit conversion, you've obviously drilled the students that they might need to do a unit conversion, and sometimes they'll just add one in even though it's not needed. So we've seen both, but it's generally that students either miss that or they do it incorrectly. Foundation tier is where students tend to get asked about answering to a specific number of decimal places. That was a challenge. And at higher tier, they tend to get asked for significant figures. And again, that was a bit of a challenge, more so on some papers than others. For me, that's a real question of, do they really not know how to do that? Or are they missing the instruction? That's for you to, to do some digging and find out, can they actually do that? Or is it just that they're not reading the question properly and looking for the instruction that's in there? This has come up again. This came up last year as well about rounding, which surprised me, but it's come up again. Incorrectly rounding, or what we see even with higher tier students is they round really early on in a multi-step calculation, and they round at each step, and then by the time they get to the final answer, it's way off. Not showing working, this comes up every year, doesn't it? Not showing working in calculations. Don't mean to generalize, but for my students that I teach, it tends to be the boys that they just go, why do I need to do that? And, and it's fine if they get the right answer because they'll probably get the marks, but actually it's meaning you can't have that error carried forward. And examiners really are looking to award marks where they can, so they will look for that, won't they, and try to apply that error carried forward where they possibly can. Standard form, where it came up, was a bit of a challenge, which probably isn't that much of a surprise. And formula triangles seem to be causing confusion, especially at foundation tier. Now, I know it's very divided about formula triangles and whether people use them or not, but it didn't seem to be helping some of the students at foundation tier particularly. The next sort of wider area is application in an unfamiliar context, so that aspect of AO2. Again, we always get students struggling with this, and we know that, we look at a question and it's so clearly linked to, for example, a required practical or a core practical, that it's very, very subtle difference, but that is enough for students to go, you haven't even taught us about this. And it's just a chemical might have changed, the name of a metal might have changed, but it's exactly the same process, it's the same method. That just completely throws them, doesn't it? We did see students when I say making more use of information in the question stem, I sort of mean referring to the information in the question stem. So that's a real positive, because we know we've got a real challenge, especially when they've got those questions that have got so much stimulus material. So there might be some text, there might be a table, there might be a diagram before they even get to the question. We know that sometimes students will just skip straight to the question and not even engage with that. They seem to be using it, so it might be that they're quoting something from that stimulus material. It didn't always get them the marks because they weren't actually doing something with it. They were just repeating what was in that question stem. But I would take that as a positive step, that students are at least looking at that information and engaging with it somehow. And at higher tier, we saw some really good practice in terms of using scientific language, even when it was in an unfamiliar context. They were looking for the clues, they'd seen which bit of science it was linked to, and they were linking back to that same scientific language that they'd used in that topic. In terms of challenges, generally, things in an unfamiliar context, we get more students leaving gaps and not attempting things when it's an unfamiliar context. We've already said that explain is a challenge, and therefore add in explain questions when it's an unfamiliar context, and it's almost like a double whammy. And where students are struggling with practical questions, if you add in an unfamiliar context, again, that's a double whammy. So they're even more of a challenge in terms of an unfamiliar context. Exam technique. It was really clear, and it came up in quite a few of the examiners' reports, that it was that students had clearly used sort of past paper questions, which is really positive. For some students, that meant they actually were answering a previous question. We know that lots of questions look the same. The more exam practice you do with students, they start going, I've seen this question before. Have I seen this question before? And you go, they can only be asked in so many ways. So you will see familiarity. It's really important to practice those exam questions. But we saw sometimes students were asking a very similar question that had come up in a previous exam series, so not really reading the detail of the question. We saw as well with where they're asked in an unfamiliar context, students clearly see which bit of science it's linked to, but then they answer the question in the context of what you did with them rather than the context in the question, which is, it's an extra step, isn't it, to check, recognize the science, answer the question, check that you're answering that particular context in the question rather than what's in your head. Usual challenges like vague language, so still students using things like amount and it. We need a ban on amount and it, so challenge that whenever, whenever they're doing verbal answers, don't stop at that, go back to them and say, not amount, not it, tell me what it is. Repeating the question stem. Again, I do see this as a bit of a challenge. I go into a lot of lessons where the system is and the expectation is that even verbally students need to answer in a full sentence, and therefore sometimes we see when they're writing in a full sentence that is repeating some of the question stem. I think sometimes it's buying them a bit of time, sometimes it's filling the lines, isn't it? So they feel like they've done something, but actually they're 3 lines down and they still haven't said anything different than is in the question stem. We've still got, particularly at foundation tier students, not able to draw one line when you've got matching boxes. We've had some instances this year, and I think whenever students are asked to draw on a figure in the actual question, we get quite a few students just missing that question out. So is it that it's not that common a question and therefore they're a bit freaked that, am I really meant to draw on that figure as part of the question? So look out for that, because students sometimes just don't attempt those questions at all. And sometimes it just seems that students are not using the number of marks available to guide their answer. And when we go back to describe and explain, if they're asked to explain and it's 3 marks and they're just giving that describe, or they're just giving one simple explanation, they're not using that to guide them. And last one, extended open response. We've seen some real positives on this, that actually most students, or more students than usual, were attempting the extended open response. So even at foundation tier, generally, we had fewer non-attempts, which is great, because particularly with foundation tier students, really what we want them to do is to have a go. The only way to be sure of not being awarded any marks is not to have a go, isn't it? So if they'll have a go, that's great. And of those that did attempt it, the majority of them were able to get at least 1 or 2 marks and get into level 1. If you look at the mark scheme, as soon as they've said something that's relevant and makes sense, then they're going to get 1 mark at least. And if you look across the series, if they do that, if they go from 0 to 1 or 2 marks for every extended response, you're getting near a grade boundary. So anything that they can do just to have a go at that. So that's a real positive. General increase in referring to the stimulus materials, as I said before, even though sometimes they're just copying what's in there. We saw more practice, such as annotating questions, like underlining the command words. The challenges link back, quite a few of these, to exam techniques. So using vague language, repeating the question stem, we've already said. And students are really being urged in the examiner's reports to use bullet points or use numbered steps, particularly if you're trying to write out, say, a method or a plan. Just make your answer more succinct and make it more logical by just using bullet points. So keep pushing that, as that's good practice for students to be able to do that, because some of them are still avoiding doing that, and they're getting themselves tied up in knots and not planning responses, and therefore they're losing the thread. Really easy on a 6 marker to lose your thread and forget to do something. So anything that you can do to annotate the question, write a little plan, scribble some notes of what they want to include. Okay, so thinking about what we can do with that data then, because I said before, we've got a wealth of data, haven't we? So thinking about this as an example, so thinking about that national data, what can you do? And actually, this same cycle of improvement, we can apply it to any kind of data that you've got. So going from the top there on this this cycle and the analysis bit, starting with, okay, what do the overall results show? So if we take this national data, that's what I've just shown with you. This is what I've just shown you. So these are the areas that are tricky. That's the analysis bit. So that bit's done for you. The next bit for you to do then is to think about, okay, well, that's nationally. Does that actually apply to my cohort? Did it apply to my cohort last year? And you can probably get onto AQA Insights or Edexcel Results Plus, and you can start to look at, did that apply to my cohort? But this just gives you places to start looking. So that reflection of, does that apply to my cohort? It could be that that's from a series of your mocks and you've done some question level analysis. Okay, well, that's what our whole year group says. Does that apply to my class? It might be that you're on a platform for homework, such as Educate, and you say, okay, that's our whole cohort. What about my class? That's my class. What about those key pupils that we're tracking? So it's just about taking that step down and honing in a bit further. So, okay, do these challenges apply to my class? Okay, yes, some of them do. What I really need to do is diagnose why. So sometimes we miss that diagnosis and we jump straight to, let's just do more of that. So extended open response is an issue, or osmosis was an issue, or stop and distance, we'll just practice more of it. We need to really diagnose why my students might have found that difficult so that we can really put an effective plan into place that's very specific, put that plan in, implement the plan, and then we're back to the top of the circle again, the top of the cycle, and saying, okay, well, how can we test whether we've made any difference to that? So thinking about what those steps might look like in a bit more detail. So that analysis, going from the top again, that might be the analysis like I've just given you. It might be your analysis from your mock that you've just done, and it might be that teachers have just filled in sort of a whole class feedback style of form as they're marking the papers. It might be that they've done a QLA. I do hope not, of like spreadsheet of every mark pointed in there, 'cause it's very time consuming. It might be that they've got something from something like Educate, and it gives them that big overview. So that's where we're starting there. Then I've got to say, okay, do I know whether this is an issue for my students? So do you know that the practicals in chemistry are an issue for your students? Do you know that application in an unfamiliar context? Have I got the data to be able to do that? If I haven't, what can I do to gather that data? Doesn't need to be really formal. I could set them a quiz on that. That could be a verbal quiz that I do in class. I could set them something on a platform to say, okay, we're going to hone in on that and look at that. So I know Educate have got questions by command words about the command words, for example. Practical, we could set them something specific. But I'm really going to look at if this is what national stuff is saying to me or whole year data is saying to me or my previous data, that's where I'm going to look to see whether those issues still apply to me. Then I need to think then, what is it? Is it that the knowledge and understanding is lacking? What's the pathway for this class been like? Have they had supply in years 7, 8, and 9? And now, yeah, we've got some gaps in the knowledge and understanding. Do they hold a common misconception? Do I know whether they hold a common misconception? I know Educate can pick that kind of thing out. I know as teachers, if we're doing the whole class feedback, we can pick that kind of thing out. So what is it that's making it difficult that I need to think about it? And then I need to think about, in terms of my action planning, is that something I'm going to do specifically as a teacher, or is it something I'm going to get them to do as a student? So is it that I'm just going to get them to practice more of it? So we're going to practice more of extended response because that's what's missing. Do I need to reteach content? Is it something that we've picked up that actually, when we look at the terminology, that isn't the same terminology that we've been using in our resources, and I need to go back and adapt something? And then think about how you're going to implement it. Are you going to have to build that into your lesson because you're going to do a reteach? Can it be part of your homework or your independent study that you've set specific tasks and specific quizzes for your students? Is it something that we can do an intervention? Is it something that needs to change at curriculum level? And then you're back to, okay, have we made any difference? And that doesn't need to be really full on. You don't need to wait for your mock to do that. You can do your quick check for understanding. You can do your quizzes. You can do your mini whiteboard. You can use your do now activities and so on. Okay. So Nick, do you want to come in now and just talk a little bit about Educate? Because I'm guessing Educate will do quite a few of these steps.
Yeah, absolutely. But I will run through really, really quickly. You don't need to obviously be an Educate customer to benefit from Tracey's fantastic presentation today. Tracey, if you could go to the next slide for me. What I'm going to do is give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the options for data and analysis. So on this page, this is what a standard quiz results page looks like. So you can see straight away at the top, you've got all those fabulous national averages. So we've got over 2 billion questions that have been answered by students. So there's an awful lot of data there. So you can identify where your students sit alongside national percentages. You've got your really nice detailed question level analysis here. So if I was to click on question 3, that would tell me absolutely what did those students answer. So 21% of the students got the answer right. Well, what did the other what did the other students answer? What were their absolute answers there? So not just they got it wrong. So you can see that level of data. If you want to skip to the next slide for me, Tracy, this is going to our analyze results. So this is a very top level screenshot at the moment, but this is where you could drill down into your educate subjects. So we would drill down into science. You could look at science for a whole year. You could look at science in terms of topics for the year. You could drill down into a particular class, into a particular student. This is currently looking at raw scores, but you could also look at strengths and weaknesses, see where a student or a class or a year group generally sit in terms of their scores, depending on the questions that you've answered. And then you can see where they are in the particular topic. If you could skip to the next one, this is looking at performance by class. So again, you could really understand whether you've got an intervention in place, whether that you can see the difference in the analysis. If you skip to the next one then for me, this is just going to look at an individual student. So you could see here we've got the national average for Alex in our example. The faded sort of squished circle there, that shows you what Alex would usually be working in this particular biology topic, but you can see using Educate you can identify if the student is working within that area or above or below. So it works really, really well for monitoring and supporting intervention. If you go to the next slide, I think that might be it. Yep. So I'll pass back across to Tracy because I just wanted to give you a little flavour, basically, of what Educate could do to support you.
Well, thanks, Nick. And I didn't know about those, comparing it by that national average. That's really, really useful because that's sort of what we're doing at a national level with after each GCSE, isn't it? Fab. This next slide, I'm not going to go through all this. You'll get the slide, but I just put down sort of 2 or 3 suggested strategies if you're trying to hone in on any one of these particular areas. And you might have a focus, you feel you need to have a focus on all of them, but you just want to think of some, what would be the quick wins for you? What might be your longer term strategies? But things like, if I just pick out one from each, if I was going to focus on command words, I really would just focus on hammering, describe and explain. So getting them to practice. Going into a non-science context, so showing them a picture, for example, say what you see, explain why, before you move into the science ones. The practicals, take it back to basics. It can be that you can do a quick check of that just to check that they've got the basics before you jump into how can we improve it, what are the variables and so on. So even it might just be a quick question and answer just to check they've got that, the what are we doing, what are we using, how are we using it, how are we taking measurements, why are we doing that particular step, why are we using that piece of apparatus and so on. Math skills, I don't suggest standalone practice in many things. We usually say in science, teach it in a context, don't we? But I think as they do in maths, you really can do standalone. So, you do now activities, you're just asking students to convert units. You're just asking them to show an answer in so many significant figures or to so many decimal places. That rote learning like they do in maths is what they're used to and could really help there. Application, I think for most of these, I've said one of the strategies is to make sure that you're doing that at Key Stage 3. So at Key Stage 3, in your topics, is there some application to something unfamiliar? Are you testing that as well at Key Stage 3? Exam technique, one thing I'd say for that as well is I would go back to Key Stage 3 and 4. When you're setting other assessments, are you using the same style? So are you using bold for instructions? Are you using units on the answer line and so on, just so they get used to that kind of format? And extended open response, the big thing is probably modeling. And I would say for foundation students, it would be about just building their confidence just to have a go. So a system I use for my low retainers is whenever we look at an extended response question and they've got the whole chunk of lines, I say to them at the beginning, I want you to cross out over half of those lines. I only want you to use those top bits just so that they know they don't need to fill that space. Because that's when they just start to waffle, isn't it? Either don't attempt it at all or stop waffling to fill the space. So key takeaways from me, and then we'll see if we've got any questions. So consider the wider skills when you're analysing the data, not just the content, because it depends what type of question and how the question was asked as well, doesn't it? Make the most of any data that you generate, whether that's a quick check for understanding or a more formal assessment. Use it. You know, I go into lots of lessons where teachers are doing the check for understanding, for example, using mini whiteboards, but sometimes teachers then don't actually do anything with that information, just move on really quickly. So you want to make the most of any assessment that you're using. And really use any tool available to do that analysis bit, the reflection bit, even the diagnosis bit, so that you can really focus on the important task of thinking about what action we're going to take and how we're going to implement that. So thinking about that cycle, you really are trying to use whatever you can to do the analysis bit for you and the reflection, gathering that data about your cohort, even the diagnosis. So is it a misconception, looking at what they got wrong, but really thinking about what do we need to do about this? Do we really need them to just get to practice more, or does it need to come more onto us as teachers to change how it was that we were teaching it in the first place? Okay. That's it from me for the presentation, Alison. So I don't know if we've got any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much to Tracey and to Nick. That was really, really informative, and I'm sure it's given us lots to think about. I'm now going to turn to the Q&A. So I'm going to have a look at the questions that people have sent in. Please do continue to add your questions as you think of them. It's completely anonymous, so any questions that you'd like to ask us, just please pop that in the Q&A, and we'll get to those. I've got a question here for Tracey. So for my foundation students, all of these topics are an issue. How should I prioritize approaching them?
Okay. Yes, I feel your pain. I know that position. Okay, when we talk about the different skill areas, so just to remind you what we said command words, practical skills, math skills, application to unfamiliar contexts, exam technique, and extended open response. I really would be focusing on command words, describe and explain, because they come up so often. So keep it pretty narrow. Practice your describe and explain. Even check with the department I'm working with tomorrow. We're going through the resources that they're already using in their PowerPoints and doing a tweak on. They've got lots of questions in the PowerPoints, but they tend to say what or which, or they don't use the actual command word. So just tweaking that to say, okay, what command word could that be? Could that be describe? Could it be explain? So I definitely focus on command words and describe and explain. I do what I said for practical work and just really take it back to basics and ask the what, the how, and the why. And the other thing that I would do is I'd really focus on exam technique, particularly for year 11. You've still got time. You've got to remember they're in a competition with everybody nationally, aren't they? So any sort of tips and tricks you can give them to just find their way through an exam and get that confidence, including linking to extended open response of crossing out some lines just so they've got the confidence to have a go. So that I'm saying still sort of 3 of them, aren't I? That's quite a lot. But I think application to unfamiliar context, if they're struggling with the basics, then they are going to struggle with that. So it would be further down my list of priorities, I think.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. In terms of other questions, this will be for Tracey. Could you explain what you mean by students writing amount and it in their answers?
Oh, yes. So when you look at mark schemes, they've got to be really specific about what they're talking about in terms of what it is what it is that's changing. So for example, they might say, or what they're measuring. So it might be, for example, that we need to measure the volume of something, and students will tend to say amount. So they need to say, do they mean volume? Do they mean mass of something? Amount is just a general term that usually in a mark scheme they're not going to get a mark if they say amount. It's got to be really specific. And on graphs, they talk about it goes up or it goes down. Got to be really specific. And I have like almost like a no entry kind of sign for amount in it with students. And even if it's verbally, we go, that's banned. Tell me what you mean. So just so they get used to saying it verbally, and hopefully that means they might write it down as well.
Amazing. I think this is one for Nick, perhaps. Do you have any quizzes specifically on practical skills and math skills? Sorry, I haven't checked myself. No need to apologize.
Never apologize. Yes, absolutely. So if you're logged into Educake, I presume that that's where you're looking. We will have practicals under each of the subjects. So we've got them for biology, chemistry, and physics, and we have a whole section on maths for science. And so you should be able to find everything that you need there. You can also write your own quiz questions as well, and they will be auto marked exactly the same as all the ones we have. I think we've got 100,000 across the whole of Educake, so that you don't need to worry. You'll still be able to get the really nice detailed QLA. And if there's anything you're looking for that you can't find, if you just drop us a line on support@educake.co.uk, and if we haven't got it, I'm sure we can create it for you. We try and be really, really responsive if we're ever asked for content where we can. So hopefully that can help you.
Amazing. Right. We've got another one for Nick. We're using OCR Gateway. Does Educate support that? I'm assuming, yeah.
Yes, it does. We cover as many boards as we can for science, so AQA, Edexcel, OCR Gateway. We've also got WJEC for our friends in Wales, and CCEA for Northern Ireland, and actually also IGCSE. Shouldn't forget our international friends as well. I should also say, while I'm here, just really quickly, we're also really, really excited to say that we will be launching A-level in January. So the editorial team are working really hard on this at the moment. So if you're interested, also drop us a line at support@educate.co.uk, and we will add you to the waiting list, and we can let you have it for free for a little bit when we launch it. So we'd be really excited to hear what you think about it as well.
Brilliant. Any other questions that people want to add to the chat? We've got a little bit more time. Right. So I think I'm just going to wrap up. If you do think of anything, I've still got one eye on the Q&A, so do add your questions there. But that brings us to the end of the webinar. So what we'll do is we'll send a follow-up email in a few days' time to everyone who registered with a video recording, so that you can easily go back and revisit anything that was covered, because I know it was a very rich webinar with a lot of information in there. So it'd be great to have the opportunity to go back and look at that. And thank you so much to all of you who took time out of your day to attend this webinar. We really, really appreciate it. Tracey, where can people follow you if they want to on social media?
LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. They can find me on there. Yes, I need to find more time to be responsive, but if somebody pops up, I will absolutely chat to them on LinkedIn.
Brilliant. And Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say LinkedIn's the best place. If you're interested in finding out about our updates, we are posting a good few times a week on LinkedIn, myself and the Educate team as well. So that's a really good place to find us.
Brilliant. So Nick mentioned support@educate.co.uk being a great email to get in touch with us. You will get a fast and human response to anything that you send to us. So if you really anything that we've mentioned that you think we can help you with, you've got any questions about that, or if you'd like a personalized demo of any of the features that we showed you today, we'd be more than happy to help. So yeah, that's support@educate.co.uk. Thank you so much to Tracey and to Nick and to everyone who attended today. Bye for now. I think that brings just one more quick check. So yeah, no more questions. So yeah, bye for now. Thank you so much for attending the webinar, and I'll see you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.